Hey guys, welcome back to Waking Cosmos, a philosophy podcast exploring questions about consciousness and its place in reality. Adrian here. Today I'm talking to the biologist Rupert Sheldrake, which is a conversation I've really been looking forward to. As many of you I'm sure will know, Rupert is a biologist who is known for his controversial theory that nature has a kind of memory which shapes the evolution of both life and the entire universe. Rupert also believes that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, and he shares today some of the reasons he holds this view with me today. Rupert is also known for his experiments which seem to demonstrate that minds may not be as confined to brains as we might generally think. And we talk about some of his research on telepathy in both humans and animals. So over the last couple of months, I've been reading Rupert's last 3 books, and I've been really excited about this conversation and looking forward to talking with him about some of his ideas. The last thing that I need to mention before we get started is that Waking Cosmos is entirely funded by subscribers on Patreon. I don't do any adverts, so if you would like to help me keep the lights on here at Waking Cosmos and support my work, please consider going over to patreon.com/wakingcosmos and becoming a Patreon subscriber. As well as helping me to continue to do this work, Patreon subscribers also get early access to every episode, as well as other perks and ways to participate. I do still have quite a way to go before I reach my goal on Patreon, where this becomes something that makes sense for me to do financially on a full-time basis, which is really my hope to eventually get to. So if you do have disposable income and you do find some value in these conversations, Patreon is the best way to support this project and my work. And my sincere gratitude to those of you who are already doing that. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. Without further delay, I give you Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Hi Rupert, great to be talking with you. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks, Adrian. Good to be with you.
So I've followed your work for a long time, and I really do think that your main theory of morphic resonance is really interesting and compelling. This idea that there's a kind of memory behind nature. And I'd really like to ask you about morphic resonance today. But I'd like to start this conversation talking about science in general, because I really also appreciate a lot of what you said about science and a need to expand science beyond a strictly mechanistic or materialist way of seeing nature. And in particular, you've done some really interesting work bringing to light some of the common assumptions that science sometimes operates on, and a number of them which might in fact be wrong and could be holding us back and essentially narrowing what science could be. So, Rupert, maybe we could start here. Could you perhaps give an example of one of these assumptions?
Yes, one of the 10 assumptions I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, is the assumption that the mind is the brain. Mental activity is brain activity, or as materialists sometimes say, minds are what brains do. In other words, all our consciousness is inside our heads. Everything we see, feel, touch, even our body image, it's all inside our heads. So when I look at something, I look out of the window now at a tree, the image of the tree that I'm seeing is somehow a representation of the tree inside my brain. Now, that's one of the assumptions I discuss, and I think it's an assumption that has almost no experimental basis, no evidential basis, and is a purely dogmatic assumption that flows from the materialist philosophy. What I mean by that is that when I see the image of the tree, the image doesn't seem to be inside my brain, it seems to be outside my brain where the tree actually is. My primary experience is of images being located in the world around me as I look at them. And I take seriously the idea that they really are there, that light comes into the eyes, changes happen in the brain, and we project out the images to where they seem to be. So the mind is extended beyond the brain rather than being all inside the brain. So that's the subject of one of the chapters in that book, for example.
Yeah, and another assumption that jumped out to me whilst you were saying that you've you wrote about in that book is the idea that there are laws of nature, which is an idea which, as you've pointed out, actually comes directly from religion and the idea of God's laws. And so maybe this unexamined assumption is preventing us from considering other possibilities. For example, as you suggested, that what we call laws of nature might in fact be more like trends which evolve over billions of years, maybe. You've talked about some of the evidence that that might actually be true. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes, the assumption that all the laws of nature were there at the moment of the Big Bang, that they're eternal and changeless, is definitely a hangover from 17th century theology, when the laws of nature were thought to be ideas in the mind of a law-giving God. God was seen as a kind of cosmic emperor and also a cosmic law enforcement agency who made everything obey the laws. It's tremendously anthropocentric imagery, and there's not a shred of evidence that all the laws were there at the moment of the Big Bang. I mean, how could one prove that? One would have to go back to the moment of the Big Bang and test to see if all the laws were there. It's just an assumption. And in a radically evolutionary universe, I think it makes much more sense to think of the laws as evolving, or better still, as habits. And that means instead of there being a kind of mind outside the universe in which these laws exist in a kind of eternal transcendent mode, which is the implicit assumption of conventional science, strange though that may seem, instead, I think that they're habits that build up within nature and there's a kind of memory. So, for example, if you make a new kind of crystal for the first time, synthesize a new chemical, crystallize it, it may take quite a long time for the crystal to form because there is no habit for that crystal forming. But once it's formed, then the next time you make it, there should be influence from the first time by the process I call morphic resonance. And the more often you do it, the more influence from the past there'll be. The habit will build up, and the result will be that the compound will crystallize more quickly and more easily. And there's already a lot of evidence that actually happens. So this view of nature shows nature as evolving through natural selection. The habits that are repeated often become more habitual. New patterns of activity that don't work don't get repeated and don't become habits. So there's a kind of natural selection giving rise to the habits of nature. It's radically evolutionary, rather than the conventional view that all these laws are fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. It makes quite a big difference in the way we think about evolution and think about nature, and I think fits the facts better.
Right. Let's stay with this really extraordinary example about crystals synthesizing more quickly the more that chemists crystallize them. And presumably, this is with rare crystals which we don't often see in nature. And apparently, this is happening no matter where in the world we're crystallizing these. Is that right?
Yes, chemists have found, they've known for a long time that if you make new compounds and crystallize them over and over again, they seem to get easier to crystallize all over the world. Although chemists know that, and it's part of the sort of folklore of chemistry, they don't, of course, explain it in terms of morphic resonance. They have other explanations that are not usually rigorously tested, but basically a way of explaining it away. Either they assume that fragments of crystals from previous crystallizations have been carried from lab to lab on the clothing or beards of migrant chemists, or they assume that the invisible dust particles with bits of previous crystals have wafted around the world in the atmosphere and have settled in labs all over the world. What I'm suggesting instead is that even if you stop migrant chemists with contaminated clothing entering the lab and to filter out dust particles from the air, this should still happen. This greater speed of crystallization. And this also predicts that compounds that have been around for a very long time, that crystallize in nature, would crystallize more easily than newly synthesized compounds. The theory also predicts that the crystals would be more stable, and as compounds become more stable, as crystals become more stable, it's harder to break them up. And that leads to the very surprising prediction that newly formed compounds will have melting points that rise because they get more stable, so it's harder to break them up. You need more heat to break them up. So the melting point should go up. And as I show in my book, A New Science of Life, which is in its third edition retitled Morphic Resonance in the United States, still called A New Science of Life in Britain, I show that there is actually evidence that melting points of new compounds do go up, whereas ones that have been around for millions of years, crystallizing in nature, are pretty stable. They've reached a sort of steady groove of habit where you don't notice any further change. So again, I think there's good empirical evidence for morphic resonance from crystals.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary idea to say that crystals potentially synthesizing more quickly would occur not just here or on the other side of the world, but on the other side of the galaxy or just anywhere in the universe. Is that really what you're suggesting? Is this an entirely non-local effect?
I'm assuming it is. Of course, I can't prove it because I don't have access to laboratories on the other side of the galaxy. But that's my assumption. You know, the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said that the best kind of scientific hypothesis is one that makes bold predictions, which can be tested experimentally. And I prefer to have the boldest possible prediction, which is that this doesn't fall off with distance. And that would mean that habits of nature that grew up anywhere in the universe would spread. No one knows how fast, but they'd spread throughout the whole universe. I think that's why the atoms and molecules on distant galaxies behave the same way as they do here, because they have the same habits rather than following the same universal laws, which is the conventional assumption. I think that the spread of these crystal forms, yes, I think it would extend across the galaxy. And this leads to the idea that if you make hundreds of new compounds and you then in labs on Earth find out which ones crystallize quicker and quicker the more often you make them, you might find that some of them don't do that. And if they've never existed on Earth, this might imply that they've existed somewhere else in the universe. And we'd actually be able to map what is new on Earth compared with the rest of the universe, a kind of space probe into the rest of the universe, just on in a terrestrial laboratory by looking at crystal forms, which would be a far cheaper way and probably more effective way of exploring what's happening elsewhere in the universe than sending heavy rockets up into space. So I think this has testable implications and ones that could actually shed light on other parts of the universe.
Yeah. To me, it's quite amazing to imagine that maybe a single group of chemists synthesizing crystals in a laboratory could be having such, cosmic ramifications to molecular chemistry all throughout the universe. And, it certainly could be possible that we've hugely, hugely underappreciated the level of our participation with the rest of the universe. But while that admittedly does strain my intuition, of course, it's not to say that it isn't true. And yeah, like you said, this could be testable, or at least we might be able to look at the ways in which different chemical compounds do speed up, and perhaps that could be an indicator of what's happening out there in the universe, and maybe the propensity of life if we were looking at rare organic compounds.
Yes, I think all those things are possible, and I mean, obviously, it's a mind-boggling idea. But after all, when you think about conventional science, it's pretty mind-boggling to think that just by studying natural phenomena in laboratories on Earth or through Earth-bound radio telescopes or observatories, or even the Hubble Space Telescope orbiting around the Earth, that we can probe the rest of the universe and come to some kind of understanding of it. It's only since the 1920s that we've recognized there are galaxies outside our own. So it's already very remarkable that we can, from this planet, form this kind of vast picture of the universe. And I think the idea that we're somehow related to it and that we are interacting with it makes this much more interesting than if we're just observing it passively, as it were, from a distant planet in the suburbs of the Milky Way.
Yeah, we have got this very dramatic expansion of our cosmic picture, still relatively fresh in recent memory. And so you've talked about this sort of more evolutionary universe with respect to nature's laws evolving rather than being fixed. How do you think that this could relate to biological evolution? Certainly, life evolved, but how does this larger idea of it, like an evolving memory, play into, for example, what we know about genes? Because I do think that your theory seems to frame evolution as less of a blind process and potentially even purposive in a way. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, the gene centered view, the neo Darwinian gene centered view, assumes that all heredity is essentially genetic, or now it's been modified to include epigenetics. This is one of the 10 assumptions I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, the idea that all biological inheritance is material. Now, we actually know what genes do. They code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some genes are involved in the regulation of the activity of other genes. In other words, they affect protein synthesis. Now, there's a huge gap between making proteins and building an organism, such as a cuckoo. You know, the shape of the cuckoo and its migratory behavior from Britain to Africa, for example. The young cuckoos know where to go. They fly there the first year after they're born and raised by birds of other species without learning from their parents, without meeting their parents. They just know what to do. Now, how you would get all that out of just making the right genes is completely unknown. And geneticists just assume that somehow there are complex interactions between proteins that will give rise to all this, the right nervous system, the right shape of the bird, the right migratory instincts, knowing where to go. But all that's a massive assumption. I don't think heredity works like that. I think the majority of inheritance of form and behavior works by morphic resonance through a kind of collective memory. Each species has a kind of collective memory. The genes play an important part, of course. They enable organisms to make the right proteins, but they don't shape the form of the organism or program the instincts. That's not what genes do. They're about protein synthesis and controlling protein synthesis. And so the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is really based on the idea that genes mutate randomly by chance, and then natural selection filters out genes that confer some kind of survival advantage. Well, that's the idea that the whole of evolution is basically driven by chance. It also gives this enormous role to genes and assumes that anything that organisms, animals, or plants learn by adapting to their environment can't be passed on. There was in the 20th century a tremendous taboo against the so-called inheritance of acquired characteristics or Lamarckian inheritance. It was, you were meant to sort of hiss like in a pantomime when someone mentioned the word Lamarck or Lysenko, the main Russian proponent of this point of view. But now the inheritance of acquired characteristics has become mainstream. It's been rebranded epigenetic inheritance. And it's now generally accepted that not only genes, but epigenetic changes which switch on or switch off genes can be inherited. But even genetics plus epigenetics is still all about genes and proteins and controlling protein synthesis. It still leaves out the inheritance of form and behavior. And that, I think, is where morphic resonance plays such an important part. It means that in evolution, it increases the role of learning and adaptation, because if animals learn a new pattern of behavior, then it can be passed on to other animals of that species by morphic resonance without needing to have changes in the gene or waiting for random mutations or natural selection to work over hundreds of generations. It gives a much greater evolutionary capacity to organisms and allows evolution to happen more adaptively and more quickly. Now, whether or not there's an overall purpose in evolution is another question. Organisms have purposes. They develop towards ends or goals, which are represented in the mathematical language of dynamics by attractors. A developing organism is attracted towards particular end forms or patterns. Instincts have attractors. Animals move towards goals. I mean, a hungry dog, for example, which sees a bone, strains at the leash to get at the bone. It's goal-directed behavior. Now, whether the entire evolutionary process has goals is very much a debatable point. I don't think it has any single overall goal. I mean, a lot of people would like to think it's all about us. But if it's all about us, then it's hard to explain the need to be 1 million species of beetles in South America, for example, most of which we're driving to extinction. It's hard to see why there's such a great diversity of life. In fact, I think if there is a purpose in evolution, one of the purposes must be the exploration of possibility, the production of diversity, because there seems to be an inherent creativity in the evolutionary process that seems to promote diversity for its own sake. And we see that, of course, in the human realm as well, through artistic creativity and cultural creativity and inventiveness of every kind. There seems to be an urge towards novelty and creativity at all levels in nature.
Yeah, this introduction of a kind of a teleology or a purpose behind evolution, I think, for something to be drawn to the future, there seems to be like a requirement that it is sensitive in some way to the value of future events or the value of future states or processes. And of course, to be sensitive to the value of a future event arguably requires subjectivity. It requires consciousness. The vehicle of value in the universe is consciousness. So, to me at least, if there is a telos or a purpose to evolution, or multiple purposes in some cosmic sense perhaps, then you could imagine that it would require minds to evolve at some level.
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is a big point of debate at present. For example, Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher of mind, in his book Mind and Cosmos, which came out a few years ago, argues for teleology or purpose in evolution, but he's an atheist, and so he's trying to find a way of having purpose without intention. Now, like you, I think that's going to be that's a hard argument to make, but he does try to make it. I mean, that basically we have a series of different views. We've got the standard materialist view. There's no purpose in evolution. There's no purpose in nature. There's just mechanical forces governed by eternal laws of nature with a sprinkling of chance thrown into the system to allow for novelty and creativity. But there's no purpose in anything. Living organisms appear to have purposes, but that's just appeared by natural selection through blind chance. Then there's the modified materialist view or atheist view that there's some kind of purpose in evolution, which is to do with the emergence of consciousness and the diversification of life, but there's no ultimate goal or underlying intention or consciousness behind that. That's the view that Thomas Nagel's trying to put forward, a kind of naturalistic, atheistic view of purpose in nature. And that's an unusual position because most people who see purpose in nature take the view you've just suggested, that there's some consciousness underlying nature, underlying the entire cosmos, and that the evolution of our consciousness and consciousness throughout the cosmos is somehow related to the ultimate mind or consciousness, which includes all things. And in many traditions, of course, that ultimate mind is called God or ultimate reality or the absolute. And I think what makes all religions different from materialistic atheism is the idea that there is a form of consciousness beyond our own. For a materialistic atheist, the only kinds of consciousness in the universe are in brains, mainly in our brains, perhaps in other animals to lesser degrees, and in lower animals perhaps to a slight degree. But basically the whole of the rest of the universe is unconscious, non-conscious. all the stars, the galaxies, unless there are other humanoids or biological beings a bit like us with brains, the entire universe is non-conscious. And there's no level of consciousness beyond our own. Whereas all religions and all shamanic systems and forms of animism have assumed there are many kinds of minds in nature, and often that there's an ultimate mind from which they're all derived, and that we do make contact with those through spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, and that this ultimate consciousness is somehow affecting the way that nature develops. Of course, traditional religious views, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, were not evolutionary in the modern sense. There was a progressivist tendency in all the Abrahamic religions. They all see a developmental process in history. Most traditional cosmologies have been cyclical, though. They've had the idea of recurring cycles, even whole universes that come and go. So the idea of developmental evolutionary processes is relatively new, and it requires new kind of thinking about how they're related to forms of consciousness beyond our own.
That's very interesting, and I'd like to come back to mystical experiences in particular, but just to comment on my reading of Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos was that he had a view of consciousness in which consciousness was fundamental in some way to the world, but it was in us and in other life approaching a kind of rarefied state. But the fundamental of consciousness was in some sense intrinsic to the world, or interiority in some sense. And that his view was that perhaps over a very long time, the universe would eventually satisfy the metaphysical conditions of its own existence by waking up in some way. And Paul Davies is a physicist. He's also said something along those lines, that perhaps the universe requires to be completely self-known in some way, and that maybe occurs over billions of years, but that completion is in some sense necessary. And it reminds me a bit of another philosopher, Teilhard de Chardin, who had a Christian view of cosmic evolution involving consciousness, which ultimately led to an omega point.
Well, yours is a very interesting reading of Nagel, and he is a panpsychist because, as you say, one of the things he's saying is that consciousness is not just in brains, it's throughout nature. And so this idea that it's the whole universe is on the way to sort of waking up, I hadn't actually got that from reading him. It wasn't as obvious to me. Now you say it, I can see that his argument's more interesting than I'd credited it with. I think for me, the thing is that part of Nagel's rhetoric is steeped in the kind of materialist background and his commitment to an atheist worldview. I mean, he says several times in his book that he's an atheist. Now, that I find rather confusing, because if one says that the whole universe is pervaded by consciousness, that it's working towards a self-realization and waking up into a kind of cosmic awareness or consciousness, which includes the whole universe, well, that's pretty close to what most people would call God. So it's a peculiar kind of atheism, and it might be confusing to call it atheistic, which he does. And in fact, we come here to the very borderline cases of, what one means by God or the divine, or by atheism, which is a denial of God. I think actually the debate, as you framed it, is much more interesting than old-style debates about does God exist or not. It's about consciousness in the universe, the nature of that consciousness, and whether or not the universe as a whole can be conscious of itself, and whether the consciousness of human beings is an important part in that process of cosmic evolution, which I think Nagel suggests, and which Teilhard certainly suggests. And that would relate to a point we were discussing earlier, that human consciousness then would become something much more cosmically relevant than simply the consciousness of biological beings on one remote planet in a relatively obscure solar system in an outlying part of a galaxy. it would have a much greater relevance to this whole process of cosmic evolution and the evolution of cosmic consciousness.
Yeah. You suggested that there's this evolving memory behind nature, but that it also involves minds, our minds and the minds of other species, and it connects them in ways that the standard view of minds that we have doesn't seem to be able to make sense of. And I know that you've done various experiments looking at the possibility, for example, that real telepathic connections in some description do exist between people and between animals as well. And you seem to have come across quite a bit of evidence that that actually exists.
Yes, well, I think the reason I'm interested in these telepathic phenomena is because what they show is that minds can be interconnected at a distance. There's a kind of non-local or entanglement between minds at a distance. Um, and I come to this not because I'm primarily interested in weird phenomena, but because I'm a biologist. And when I started thinking about the possibility of telepathy, I thought, if this really exists, then it's not something supernatural or paranormal. It's likely to be something natural and normal. That's a form of communication rooted in our animal heritage, our biological heritage. So I started looking for telepathy in animals before I looked at people. And I thought I'd start with the animals we know best: dogs, cats, horses, parrots, and so on, domesticated animals. And I started looking around at what they do and asking people who have a lot of experience with animals if they'd ever noticed that these animals could pick up their thoughts or intentions. When I did that, I found that not only my own experience, but many other people's experience suggests that animals do indeed respond. Dogs are particularly sensitive to our thoughts and intentions, or so are cats and horses. Then the standard argument is, yes, of course, they can pick these up. They're sensitive to subtle cues. They pick up body language and so forth. That's all true. But they also respond to thoughts and intentions at a distance. And the easiest to investigate experimentally is the ability of dogs and cats to know when their owners are coming home. About 50% of households with dogs and about 30% of households with cats, according to randomized surveys in Britain and America, people in those households say that their dog or cat anticipates the arrival of a member of the family. And sometimes this is 10, 15 minutes, even half an hour in advance. The skeptics say, oh, well, they're just coming at routine times, so, or they're just, the longer the person's been away, the more they start waiting, or they hear the sound of a car engine from miles away because they've got sensitive hearing, all those kinds of arguments. But without any evidence. These are speculations. So I've tested them. And in experiments where we film the place the dog waits, we have people come home from at least 5 miles away at random times that are not known to them in advance, and in vehicles they've never been in before. The dogs still know. They seem to pick up people's intentions from a distance. And in the human realm, the commonest kind of telepathy is between people in relation to telephone calls. More than 80% of the population have had the experience of thinking of someone who then calls on the phone and then saying something like, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." Again, the skeptical way of dismissing this is to say, well, you think about people all the time. One of them then rings and you falsely imagine it's telepathy. You just forget the millions of times you're wrong. Well, again, that's a reasonable hypothesis, but in science we need evidence, not just hypotheses. And when I looked into this, I found none of these skeptics had ever done a single experiment to look at this. It was just an armchair argument. I've done experiments on telephone telepathy, many of them. All this is published in peer-reviewed journals, where the subject names 4 people they might be telepathic with. They sit at home being filmed on a video camera with a landline phone with no caller ID. My research assistant picks one of the callers at random using random number tables or random event generator or throwing a die, rings up that person and asks them to call their friend. So think about them for a moment or two, and then call them. And then the phone rings. The person has to guess before they pick it up which of those four callers is calling. And if they were just guessing, if it was just coincidence, they'd be right roughly one time in four, 25%. In fact, in these experiments, the hit rate was 45%, with hundreds of trials, massively significant statistically. So I think the evidence is pretty good for the existence of telepathy, not just from my own experiments, but many other people's as well. But the very mention of telepathy creates a kind of strong emotional reaction in committed materialists, because they believe it can't possibly happen because the mind's nothing but the brain and couldn't work at a distance. Therefore, all the evidence for it must be flawed or fraudulent. And they get incredibly angry sometimes about this, because it violates a taboo that the materialist worldview creates against psychic phenomena. But most people in the population don't have a problem with it. In fact, lots of people just take it for granted. And sometimes people say to me, why do you waste your time trying to prove things that everyone already knows? Well, there's a sense in which most people do know these things, but if they've got a university degree, they often feel they ought to pretend that they don't believe in them or they're impossible. So, yes, I think there's a lot of evidence. The interesting thing, though, is if you look at the natural history, telepathy occurs between bonded members of groups. It doesn't happen with random people, or at least not very much. Typically, it happens between dogs and their owners, the people who are strongly bonded with their dogs or their cats or their horses. It occurs between humans, telephone telepathy, between members of families, mothers of children, lovers, husbands and wives, close friends, close colleagues. And I think that it's to do with social bonds between members of bonded social groups. And I think in the wild, among wild animals, it's an essential means of communication when the group splits up. For example, when wolf cubs are left in the den and the adult wolves go out hunting, ranging over tens or even hundreds of miles, the social bonds between the adults and the young in the den are not broken, they stretch, and they can be sensitive to what's happening to the others, especially to things to do with emotions and needs, through these emotional bonds, which are aspects of what I call morphic fields. But these only occur between bonded members of social groups. In a sense, this is the analogy in physics that's closest to this is quantum entanglement. In a quantum system, if electrons or photons leave an atom or molecule, they remain entangled with it, they're still part of the same system. And these non-local connections or entanglements stretch over enormous distances, miles and miles. They don't fall off with distance. But what they depend on, quantum entanglement, depends on having been part of the same system to start with. And I think that's very much the case in telepathy with animals and with people. They're part of the same social group. And even at a distance, this linkage remains. So anyway, I think that telepathy is it reveals something about the way that social bonds work and the way that minds work. And as far as most people are concerned in Britain and everywhere else in the world, this is simply a fact. It's part of everyday life. Most people have had experiences of it. It's only when you enter the kind of educated, academic, materialist, intellectual world that it becomes intensely controversial and where there's a whole culture of denial. It's remarkable, actually, the denialism around something which is not only part of everyday life for lots of people and for lots of animals, but also something for which there's now very good scientific evidence.
Yeah, it's really a very interesting subject, and there does seem to be a lot of evidence that these psi connections do occur. And I just wanted to mention, because it relates to your work, but my dad is actually an identical twin, and he and his brother have had quite a number of experiences that are fairly suggestive of this kind of connection, which is really quite difficult to explain within a kind of a materialist view. To just give an example, which you'll be very familiar with, is that there's been quite a number of times where they've called each other on the phone at exactly the same time, such that the line becomes engaged. And what makes it a bit more interesting is that they don't necessarily speak all that regularly, and they don't have a scheduled time to call. But apparently, this has just happened a surprising number of times, and it's just one of several strange apparent connections that they believe that they've had with each other over the years.
No, I was just going to say, identical twins are particularly interesting in this because they're often even more connected than other kinds of people. And I think the fact that they've, shared the same womb when they're developing and even come from the same egg is just one of those things that establishes this kind of entanglement or connection more strongly than with most other people.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that twins seem to be significantly more prone to these psi experiences? Is there a significance of their being quite similar, both physically and mentally, perhaps as well, from a kind of morphic resonance view of their tuning in to the same information in some way?
Yes, I think so. I mean, morphic resonance occurs most strongly between organisms that are similar. And, the maximum similarity you can have really is with identical twins. So they'd be the most morphically resonant of all people. Actually, I think this helps to shed light on some of the puzzles of genetics. A lot of genetical research is based on identical twins. The idea is that if you have identical twins separated soon after birth, then any similarities that show up between them in later life must be genetic, must be part of nature rather than nurture. They've had different environments, different educations, different families, different upbringings, because they've been adopted by different families. So if it's all about the environment, they ought to be very different. If they're very similar in spite of the environment, the normal argument is this proves it's just genetic. And a lot of the evidence for genetic determinism on which sociobiology and selfish gene theories are based comes from these identical twin studies. But what they haven't taken into account, because they've either not thought about it or simply dismissed it out of hand, is the possibility that these similarities might be due to morphic resonance. The twins separated soon after birth are very similar. They've shared the same womb, they have the same genes, they have the same cytoplasmic source, they come from the same egg, monozygotic twins. They're in extraordinarily strong resonance with each other, even if separated, even if growing up in different families. And many of these twin studies have shown extraordinary similarities between twins that even geneticists would not have expected. Things like calling their kids by the same name, having similar hobbies, choosing furniture the same color, and so forth. Even extreme genetic determinists wouldn't have expected that. So I think that, in fact, morphic resonance can account for many of these phenomena with identical twins. And because people have just assumed that these similarities must be genetic, it's one reason that genes have been grossly overrated for decades. And in fact, there's now a crisis in genetics. It's called the missing heritability problem, where it turns out that genes just don't account for most of what they were supposed to account for, because they got a wild overestimate of their importance from these identical twin studies by neglecting the possible role of morphic resonance.
Yeah. To me, I get the impression the existence of these telepathic connections points in the direction of thinking that mind or consciousness is more fundamental to reality. Would you say that that's what the extended mind phenomena like telepathy are suggesting? Do they point toward panpsychism?
I don't think in themselves they point towards panpsychism because, for example, some people in psychical research, at least in the 19th century, were Cartesian dualists who thought that mind and body were completely separate characteristics and that mind was present in human beings but not in animals or other aspects of nature. So it's possible to accept telepathy and accept a non-local aspect to mind without being a panpsychist, by being a kind of Cartesian dualist following Descartes' view that humans have non-material minds, other animals don't, and these non-material minds are not localized in space and time. So that worldview does allow for telepathy without being panpsychist. I'm not a Cartesian dualist. I'm much more sympathetic to the panpsychist view, but I don't think telepathy is a decisive evidence for one of those views or the other. It is decisively against the mechanistic materialist view that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and confined to the inside of the head, which is why dogmatic materialists are so violently opposed to psychic phenomena and go to enormous lengths to deny their very possibility. Dualists accept them on the whole, but without accepting panpsychism. And I suppose there are some panpsychists who may not accept telepathy. I don't know. Most panpsychists are, generally speaking, more open-minded.
I noticed in your recent book that you've talked about the rise of panpsychism and views of nature in which consciousness is more fundamental, and that these are increasingly being taken seriously by philosophers and scientists. Why do you think things are moving in this direction? What's changed or what's changing, do you think?
I think there are several reasons for this move towards panpsychism. The idea there's some kind of level of mind or psyche in all things, even electrons and atoms. I think the main reason within philosophy of mind for people adopting this is the sheer difficulty of explaining human consciousness. The so-called hard problem is a hard problem for materialists because they have a worldview that says the universe is made of unconscious matter or physical stuff. Physicalism is very, very similar to materialism, except it says it's physical rather than material. In effect, they mean the same. But they assume that the physical reality of which the universe is made is non-conscious. Then there's the problem, if you start with totally non-conscious matter and physical stuff, then evolution happens and minds and brains appear and so on. There's the problem as to why non-conscious matter, however complex its arrangement, should become conscious. How does consciousness spring out of a totally non-conscious world and seem to be completely different from non-conscious matter? That is the hard problem for materialists, the existence of human consciousness. Some of them try to say, well, consciousness doesn't really exist, or if it exists, it doesn't do anything. It's just an epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain. Or some of them say it's an illusion. It doesn't do anything. We have no free will. Everything would go on just the same as if we weren't conscious, if we were zombies. But the trouble with these explanations is they're pretty unconvincing. And for example, to say that consciousness is an illusion doesn't explain consciousness because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It presupposes consciousness. You can't have an unconscious illusion. So all these attempts to explain away consciousness look increasingly implausible. And that's why some materialist philosophers like Galen Strawson, and I think Thomas Nagel was propelled by this line of argument too. The idea is that consciousness, if it's present throughout all nature, even in electrons, atoms, and so forth, then it's a difference of degree. And the emergence of human consciousness is not something that just appears out of nowhere, but it appears out of a less conscious forms of matter.
So we've talked a little bit about consciousness beyond the brain, and I'm really curious to get into some of these other types of minds that you've talked about beyond human minds and even other animals. And the one that I found really curious that I've heard you talk about on several occasions is this suggestion that stars might be conscious. So Rupert, what is it that makes this idea compelling or plausible to you?
Well, there are several lines of argument. First of all, if you take a panpsychist view, which increasing numbers of people do, even former materialists like Galen Strawson and Thomas Nagel, for example, if you take a panpsychist view, which is becoming increasingly taken seriously, as you mentioned, within the academic and philosophical worlds, then What you're saying is that there are minds or some kind of conscious or mental activity at all levels of nature in self-organizing systems. What panpsychists are saying is that self-organizing systems have some kind of mental or experiential aspect. And self-organizing systems include atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, animals, plants, flocks of birds, planets, solar systems, galaxies. They don't include chairs, tables, rocks that have rolled down mountains, computers, cars, and machines. Those are not systems that organize themselves. The tables, chairs, computers, and things are made in factories. They're put together. And a rock that rolls down a mountain and splits as it randomly bounces into other things. It's subject to external forces rather than growing or forming itself. Whereas a plant forms itself, a crystal forms itself, a solar system forms itself, a sun forms itself. So on that general argument, then just as atoms and molecules have some kind of mind, so would stars and galaxies. And you can't really have a form of panpsychism, which means psyche everywhere, pan means everywhere, and say, oh, well, this only applies to atoms and molecules and up to the level of brains, and then it's back to business as usual with cosmology and astronomy. To be consistent, you have to take panpsychism seriously, so you have to consider that stars might be conscious beings. And secondly, all traditions throughout the world have assumed that the sun is a conscious being. It's usually a god or a goddess. In Japan, the sun is a goddess. In India, Surya, the sun is a god. For the Greeks, Apollo was the sun god. For the Egyptians, Horus. So most traditional cultures have thought of the sun as a conscious being. Gods are conscious beings, they are not unconscious beings. And even in our own culture, children until the age of 10 or 11 think of the sun as a conscious sort of being. They draw it with a smiley face. So this idea of the sun as a conscious being is found all over the world. It's part of traditional culture everywhere. It follows from the panpsychist point of view. And also, if you then say, well, how would it work? Most people, even materialists, would assume that the interface between our own minds and brains is through the electromagnetic activity, the alpha waves, the nerve impulses, and so on. It's the electromagnetic activity which is the interface between the physical brain and the mental activity associated with it. Well, the sun has incredibly complex patterns of electromagnetic activity all the time. We're learning more and more about them. And therefore, I think the idea that there could be a mind interacting with the body of the sun through these electromagnetic fields is fairly plausible by analogy with our brains. So those are all reasons for taking seriously the idea the sun and other stars might be conscious. And then if you look at the counter-argument, the materialist worldview, which says the sun is unconscious, what are their arguments? All they've got is the general assumption that all matter is unconscious, therefore the sun's unconscious. But this is not an argument, not based on any kind of evidence at all. It's simply an a priori assumption. So I think that, to put it as mildly as possible, it's an open question. And I think it's something that's absolutely up for discussion and debate.
Right. And I think it might sound pretty outlandish to some people to consider that a star could be conscious, but I think it's maybe less controversial than people might think, especially when we consider that one quite popular theory about consciousness at the moment, which is integrated information theory, which we've talked about several times on this podcast previously. But essentially it's a form of panpsychism, and it's got quite a few supporters in the mainstream. And so just to describe it very simply, integrated information theory says that integrated information is what is consciousness. And I don't know whether or not that's true, but one of the implications is that there could be a lot of integrated information and therefore consciousness associated with other things other than life, including potentially cosmological phenomena like black holes. And one of my previous guests, Mike Johnson from the Qualia Research Institute, whose t-shirt I'm wearing right now, incidentally, but he pointed out that a huge amount of integrated information could be associated with the black hole, and like I said, perhaps other cosmological phenomena as well. And maybe even the Big Bang was a hugely conscious event in some sense, in that there could have been potentially a huge amount of integrated information. So, this seemingly extraordinary claim that the sun has consciousness or has a mind in some sense that we don't fully understand, it might eventually be what comes out of this theory, which seems to be quite popular right now.
Yes, no, I agree. I think integrated information theory, an attempt to define consciousness in terms of its ability to integrate. And I think that's the right approach in the sense that has this integrative function. That's what it does. And I think the idea the sun would have a kind of integrative information, or the entire galaxy, would make sense to me. And then indeed the entire universe, if the whole Big Bang had this, then no doubt the entire universe has integrated information. After all, the gravitational field, which is the universal field, has everything within it and responds to everything happening in the universe. In that sense, the gravitational field is sensitive to everything that happens and knows everything that happens in the universe, and in some sense integrates it. So even if we think just in terms of the known fields of physics, the gravitational field's like a kind of sense organ for the whole universe, which will know and feel where everything is. And I think when we move into this way of thinking, it doesn't deny what we know from regular science. It makes it much more interesting. I'm really pleased that these discussions are moving in this direction.
Yeah, I'm encouraged by it as well. I've just read your latest book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. So, in this book, you talked about various practices which exist that can potentially help us to connect with a larger reality and to enter into deeper relationship with the world. And you talked about several different practices, including meditation, fasting. There's a chapter about psychedelics, which is very interesting. So, Rupert, if you had to summarize, what was the message that you set out to put across in this book?
I discuss 7 different spiritual practices in the book, including some that aren't normally thought of as spiritual practices, like sports or learning from animals. That these practices enable our minds consciously to connect with forms of consciousness beyond our own, with greater realities. Now, all religious and shamanic practices are about connecting consciously with other forms of consciousness, non-human forms of consciousness. And that's why people do spiritual practices. That's why they're spiritual as opposed to purely physical. They're about forming connections. And even sports, which most people don't think of as spiritual practice, has several things that relate it to other spiritual practices. One is being in the present. A lot of spiritual practices are about getting out of the ruminative mind, the kind of internal dialogue, the chatter inside our minds that goes on much of the time. Many spiritual practices are about being here now, being in the present, because you can only experience conscious presence of a consciousness greater than your own or any consciousness in the present. You have to be present. And meditation works by shutting down the default mode network, the network of brain activities concerned with rumination, internal dialogue. And through meditation, people can experience being in the present. And this is often enormously liberating. It gives you feeling that you're in a presence greater than a conscious presence greater than your own. Now, people also get that through sports. If you're in sort of halfway up a rock face, and if you miss a handhold or a foothold, you'd fall off, and you might be dangling on the end of a rope, or if you're climbing without a rope, you'd crash to your death. Then you're totally in the present. If you're in the middle of a football game and someone's passing a ball and you have to be aware of where everyone is, you're not worrying about whether you paid the gas bill or what your girlfriend said yesterday that upset you or that kind of thing. I mean, you have to be totally in the present. So sports, one way of doing this. Fasting can lead to a change in the way the mind is working and the degree of attention one can pay to other spiritual practices like meditation. Psychedelics often open up people's minds to the sense that they're part of a greater conscious reality than their own. I think it's particularly interesting that in the recent book on psychedelics by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, he himself starts as a materialist and an atheist. Then he has several psychedelic experiences and ends the book by saying that it's completely changed his view of consciousness. He now sees it much more widely distributed in nature, not just confined as a kind of bubble inside human brains. I think, incidentally, relating to our previous bit of our conversation about panpsychism, that one reason people are drawn to it is not just through the intellectual arguments, but because many people have taken psychedelics, and psychedelics often give that sense that we're connected with mental realities greater than our own. So I think that these are all reasons why spiritual practices can help us. And when we form these connections, we usually feel happier. What makes people unhappy is the feeling of disconnection, pointlessness, meaninglessness, separation, and so on. And generally speaking, what makes people happy is the feeling of connection, being part of something greater than themselves. That's why being in love is happy making much of the time, and why most religions think that joy is an inherent part of ultimate consciousness. When we contact that ultimate consciousness, whether we call it God or not, then there's often a feeling of bliss or joy associated with that, which is why mystical experiences usually uplifting and inspiring and change people's lives, even if they only last a few minutes. So in my book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, I'm talking about 7 different practices, very different ones. I mean, like sports, psychedelics, fasting, celebrating holy days and festivals. These kinds of practices are all different ways of connecting with forms of consciousness beyond our own. Most people who do them find them helpful. They give their life more meaning, a greater sense of connection. And there's now a lot of scientific research that shows that people who have regular religious and spiritual practices are, to put it simply, happier, healthier, and live longer than those that don't. So I feel that rediscovering spiritual practices is very important personally. It certainly is for me, but also as part of this change in worldview that we're talking about, because the idea of consciousness being more than just inside human heads is something you actually experience through spiritual experiences that can come through spiritual practices. It's not just a theory, it's an experience, and experiences are much more persuasive than theories.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect back to what you were talking about with psychedelic experiences as ways to connect with a more than human range of consciousness. And one of the points that you raised, which stood out to me about the psychedelic experience, is that different psychedelics do seem to invoke similar motifs and experiences in the people that take them. So, for example, when people take ayahuasca, there's often these very common motifs like snakes and Aztec art and a lot of imagery that we might typically associate with the region and presumably the historical users of these substances. So I wanted to get your view about this because in your book you connect it with your theory of morphic resonance in a very interesting way. So why do you think it is that psychedelics can connect people with very similar experiences?
Well, I think as you say, this, my own view, depends on the morphic resonance idea. Morphic resonance depends on similarity. If things are similar to what's happened before, then there's a resonance across time and across space. So there's a kind of memory transfer. Now, if you take ayahuasca, then it affects your nerve endings and your nerve cells and your brain in a similar way to the way that it affects other people, not just the brain, the rest of the body. I mean, often associated with nausea and bodily sensations as well as changes in the brain. So if you take ayahuasca, your body and brain come into a similar state to people who've taken it before you. Therefore, there's a kind of morphic resonance from those who've taken it in the past. And those who've taken it over the longest period in the past are people in shamanic cultures in the Amazon. That's where this mixture of plants comes from. And it's only really been widely popularized in the last sort of few decades in the West, but its source and origin are in these Amazonian cultures, many of which have mythologies about jaguars and snakes and so on. And then when people take ayahuasca in urban settings, knowing nothing of Amazonian mythologies, they often have similar imagery. Now, I think this is because by morphic resonance, they're drawing on a kind of collective memory of ayahuasca experiences. And I think the same would go for other drugs. I mean, if people take mushrooms of the kind that have been taken traditionally in Mexico, magic mushrooms, then they may have more kind of Mexican type imagery, and indeed some seem to. So this is really an interpretation in terms of morphic resonance of a kind of collective experience that builds up through psychedelics, and different psychedelics have different backgrounds. Another way of putting it is to say that they draw upon sort of archetypes in the collective unconscious that are associated with those particular drugs. And the term collective unconscious from Jung, the psychologist, is in many ways a different way of talking about morphic resonance. Archetypes in the collective unconscious are rather like memories in the collective memory through morphic resonance.
Yeah. So in your idea, potentially in people's experiences of these psychedelics, they're tuning into ancient thought forms in a kind of collective consciousness sense, which is preserved in this deep memory that you describe in morphic resonance. And I think Albert Hofmann, the chemist who first synthesized LSD, was also quite open to an explanation along these lines. Is that right?
I don't know. I mean, so certainly Hoffman found that when he was asked by Gordon Wasson and by Schultes to find out the active principle of magic mushrooms, which he did, and he tried out psilocybin on people in Switzerland who had no knowledge of Mexican culture or shamanic use, and they had sort of Mexican visual imagery. So I think Hoffman was driven to the idea that there was a kind of tapping into a collective sort of memory, not on theoretical grounds, but on the basis of his own observations of people taking these substances. Yes, so I think he was definitely open to that. He was a wonderfully open-minded scientist and really a kind of inspirational figure. And the fact he lived till over 100 with a clear mind and in remarkably good health is actually quite a good testimony.
Yeah. So we're coming up towards the end of our time today. The last thing that I really wanted to get your thoughts about, Rupert, is the observation that you've made in several places. And it's this idea that the more that we learn about physics and the universe at large, the more that the universe seems to be more evocatively described as an organism, especially in contrast to a machine, which has been, as you talk about, the sort of lens through which science has used to think about the universe for a very long time. So, what would you say that we've learned about the universe, which is now leading us toward this more organismic view, potentially?
Well, I think, first of all, there's the Big Bang theory itself. It's like a myth of the origin of all things from the cosmic egg. And there are various cultures that have had origin myths of a hatching of the cosmic egg. And the universe then grows like a gigantic organism from this egg. Well, the Big Bang is much more like that than the image of a machine. The 17th century model of the cosmos, which is the foundation of the mechanistic worldview. That's when the idea of the universe as a machine was first established as the foundation of modern science. Their view of the universe was that God created a machine and he was like a gigantic engineer, and then pressed the start button, started it in motion, and it went on automatically thereafter. And I suppose this seemed fairly plausible to some people because There were already, since the Middle Ages, these astronomical clocks that worked on clockwork that modeled the movements of the moon and the planets. And so there were actually clockwork models of the cosmos, pretty crude models, but nevertheless models, and they were machines. And so you could think of the universe as a machine and God as a machine maker. Well, the Big Bang is nothing like that. No machine starts very small and very hot and then expands and cools down and forms new structures within it. The growth and formation of new structures as it gets bigger is much more like an embryo or a plant seed germinating and giving rise to a whole tree. Much more structure appears than was there in the first place. So this is implicitly an organic, organismic model of the universe. And then machines have parts that react with each other by pushing and pulling, or in modern machines like computers through electric currents. Well, the universe isn't really like that. It has an integrative quality. All organisms have an integrative quality that integrates the different parts of the organism together. And the universe, as presently conceived in terms of Einstein's theory of general relativity, is within the gravitational field. The gravitational field is not in space-time. The gravitational field, according to Einstein, is space-time. It provides the framework within which everything happens and integrates and unifies everything together. The gravitational field links everything in the universe. There's nothing outside the gravitational field of the universe. It's like the soul of the universe. In fact, in the Middle Ages, people talked about the anima mundi, the soul of the universe, which held everything together, within which everything was situated. And what we have now, the idea of the gravitational field, the universal gravitational field, again, is like this rediscovery of the soul of the universe. And it's not just the gravitational field, the electromagnetic field is also universal and links everything together. The fact we can see distant galaxies and stars billions of light years away, and we can't see them with our naked eye, but we can detect them with radio telescopes and other detection apparatus. We detect them because the light from them or radio waves from them have traveled over billions of light years, and we can detect them here on Earth. Again, that's because the whole universe is permeated by the electromagnetic field, which is a medium for all the light that moves through it and through which we know of the existence of other parts of the universe. So again, that's another unifying field which includes all things and links all things together. So I think all of these make the universe much more like an organism than like a machine. And in fact, that's how most traditional cultures have thought of the universe. It's been like a giant organism, not like a machine. And in fact, when you think about it, the mechanistic worldview is deeply anthropocentric. I mean, only humans make machines, and in fact, only modern humans make machines. So it's a kind of projection of one of our particular human activities onto the whole of nature. Whereas everywhere we look, we see organisms, animals and plants and other people. And organisms are much more common in nature and in our experience than machines are, and provide a much better source of metaphors. I mean, it's metaphorical, whichever way you look at it. But I think it's a more illuminating metaphor to think of the universe as an organism and as the galaxies as kind of organisms within it, and solar systems as organisms, and suns and planets as organisms, like our own planet Gaia, which is often thought of as a living organism, both in modern science and in traditional mythologies.
Yeah, I think it's a very transportive way of thinking about essentially the same scientifically revealed universe, and yet looking at it through this way, we do indeed seem to see further and with greater understanding and even more of a place for ourselves through this more organismic frame. And as you pointed out, a machine is really something that humans create, and a lot of what determines what a machine does exists in the minds of the engineers or the designers that created them. And in the modern cosmology, the idea of that kind of a god, at least, seems naive. And so, in that sense, the metaphor for the universe as being a machine has lost its designing authority. I suppose the way that I think about the universe as having comparisons with an organism is not so much it having these sort of distinct features of organisms like you might find in a scientific textbook, but it's more that it seems to share in the archetypal idea of an organism as being alive, self-realizing, self-perpetuating, it's evolving, and it's essentially a meaningful whole in a deep sense. But also, quite significantly, the universe has these mysterious capacities for consciousness and intelligence, which are expressed certainly in life and perhaps beyond it as well. So yeah, Rupert, what do you think is the significance of this paradigm shift? Do you see a form of scientific animism approaching on the horizon?
Well, panpsychism is a form of scientific animism, yes. I mean, I thought that this is the fundamental shift for quite a while. In 1990, I published a book called The Rebirth of Nature, which is really about this shift, which I thought even then was beginning to happen. It's been happening with an accelerating pace in more recent years. Yes, I think that what we're heading for is a much more scientific animism, and that will also lead to shifts in theology. You see, in the Middle Ages, people had an animistic worldview in Europe. The standard view taught in the universities like Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris and Bologna was that the earth is alive, the universe is alive, the stars are intelligent beings, all animals and plants have souls. That's why the word animal comes from the Latin word anima, meaning soul. It was an animistic worldview, and Christianity was a kind of animistic religion, and God was the living God of a living world. Then, with the 17th century revolution in science, the universe became an automatic machine. There was no souls in animals or plants. They were just mechanisms, unconscious, inanimate, literally inanimate mechanisms. And then God became a kind of external machine maker, a kind of super engineer and mathematician who designed the machinery and started it going in the first place, and then sort of retired, leaving it to run automatically, occasionally intervening through miracles. Well, that view of God is the God which atheists don't believe in, and I'm not an atheist. I don't believe in that view of God either. I think that what we're coming back to is the idea of nature as a whole of universe as a kind of living organism, a kind of scientific animism, and a view of consciousness that's emerging from the whole cosmos and in underlying all nature as well. So it can be a kind of pantheistic animism that God is nature, nature is God, or it can be something that's in theological terms called panentheism, where God is both everywhere and in everything. So the idea is that God is in nature. There's a living, conscious being expressed through all nature and in nature, and that all nature, the entire cosmos, is within this divine mind. So nature is in God and God is in nature, as opposed to an automatic machine that's inanimate and unconscious, and an external God who's not part of nature, is supernatural, which is a very incredible view of God for most people, and rightly so. So I think this is leading to a shift, not only of our understanding of nature, but our understanding of consciousness, forms of consciousness beyond our own level, and forms of ultimate consciousness and meaning.
Rupert, that's really wonderfully put. I'd love to continue talking with you, but I want to thank you for spending some time with me today and talking about these ideas of yours, and I've really enjoyed it. Where should people go to find out more about your work and stay up to date with what you're up to?
Well, the books we've been talking about today, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in America, is the overview of these dogmas of science and how we can go beyond them. Then Science and Spiritual Practices, and my most recent book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, are about spiritual practices, scientific studies of them, and how we can actually in our own lives do things that enable us directly to experience forms of consciousness beyond our own. And then there's my website, www.sheldrake.org, which has a lot of information about my books. There are many podcasts there. I also have a YouTube channel linked to from my website with many of my talks and dialogues, including dozens of dialogues with my friend Terence McKenna. We had many, many conversations. Some of them are on video and are available online on my website. Many of them were simply audio taped. And there's more than 30 different dialogues with Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham, trialogues, three-way conversations, available on my website on the trialogues section, plus a whole series of podcasts and dialogues with Mark Vernon, with Matthew Fox, and with other people. So there's a wealth of information there, all free, for anyone who's interested. And then again, this list of books, which the last three of them, The Science Delusion, Science and Spiritual Practices, and Ways to Go Beyond, are all available in audiobooks as well as printed books and ebooks.
I'll definitely make sure that there are links to those things in the description of this episode. So if people want to check out your website or your other books, they'll be able to just go to the description of this podcast and go straight there. Well, thanks again, Rupert. Really a pleasure and an honour to speak with you. And perhaps we can do this again sometime in the future.
Yes, Adrian, and a pleasure to speak to you as well. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. As always, I'm really interested to hear your ideas and reflections about the subjects we discussed in the podcast, and I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Wherever you may be listening to this podcast, clicking like or giving us a nice rating or a nice review really does help us out algorithmically, and of course I encourage you to share the conversation with anyone that you think might be interested. Finally, please also keep in mind that Waking Cosmos is supported entirely by our community on Patreon. So if you do find some value in these conversations and you'd like to help me keep putting them out, you can subscribe over at patreon.com/wakingcosmos, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to every episode. And for those of you who are already supporting the podcast, thank you so much for your kindness and your generosity. Do join us next time when I'll be talking with the panpsychist philosopher Philip Goff to explore his theory of cosmopsychism. But that is about it from me today. I'm Adrian Nelson. Until next time.